Hello everyone. Today I thought I would start a series on an empire within the world of Nuran. The Nakarthan Empire was a continent-spanning empire that spanned for centuries, going through prosperous and turbulent times. There are numerous stories to tell of such an empire, but the story I will be telling in this series will be of its history, but not just of the Nakarthan Empire, but also of the Narthans as a people. Once, they were living as hermits in the mountains of Mashka. Thousands of years later, they would sit upon the throne of the largest empire that Ahri had ever seen. With that said, let's begin. The region of Mashka has a diverse population. Many races and cultures live in this region together. The fertile land goes hand in hand with the many lakes and rivers, which gives the fresh water needed for a large, sustainable population. The many rivers also help with commerce and travel. Various kingdoms and empires would rise and fall throughout the millennia from Mashka, with the earliest kingdoms taking shape before written history in the First Era. But for this video, we need to look not at the many fertile valleys of Lower Mashka, but instead to the mountains in the northeast, where the Mononarthans lived since the Second Era. The Mononarthans were a race of Wolfa. Wolfa are wolf people who generally live in cold terrain, usually forests, or in the case of the Mononarthans, the Kurzy mountains of northeastern Mashka. The Kurzy mountains, in comparison to other mountain ranges in Ahri, would seem rather small compared to the sprawling mountains of Goldland, or the tall peaks of the Marthiric mountains. But to the foreigners out west, where fields dominated the terrain, the Kurzy mountains were nearly impenetrable. And besides, the land lacked much of the resources that the rest of Mashka had or needed anyway. In order to live in the mountains, the Mononarthans had to herd various mountain animals like the Kurzi goat, a type of Mashkan mountain goat that were popular due to their ability to survive in the mountains and produce a lot of milk. The Mononarthans had to eat whatever the mountains gave. While they had livestock and domesticated animals, the Mononarthans would really eat anything that they could forage in the mountains. Sometimes they ate grass, bugs like beetles and spiders, or whatever else the mountains had to offer. Their stomachs had adopted to this lifestyle. There was actually a common saying in Mashka which said, the Mononarthans loved their goats so much that they developed the stomach of one. Water was scarce in the mountains. There were several ways that the Mononarthans could find water. There were a number of mountain springs and large rivers that started in the Kurzy Mountains, where the Mononarthans could drink the water. If there was no water source around, sometimes they would boil nearby snow into water before consuming it. But it was not just water that they drank, but milk as well. The milk of Kurzy goats and other domesticated animals helped to sustain them. In fact, the Mononarthans typically drank more goat's milk than they did water. It was seen as a symbol of strength to drink the goat's milk, a sign that somebody could handle the rough life of the Kurzy Mountains. There is a Mononarthan joke that equates water drinkers to being lazy people, as they would rather sit along a river all day than handle livestock or protect their tribe. Now, in order to protect their livestock, the Mononarthans also domesticated wolves and certain mountain cats, like the Mashkan mountain panther, who were one of the few panthers that could be domesticated. These animals also served as a source of milk, and sometimes meat when food was running low. However, if the domesticated population was low, the Mononarthans had another trick they could pull, that being trade. South of the Kurzy Mountains were mines filled with metals, including Bangar, a rare metal that was used to mint coins in Mashka. They were also abundant with iron and lead. The Kurzy Mountains, meanwhile, only had tin and iron. Stone was considered a far more useful resource from the Kurzy Mountains, as many of the kingdoms in Mashka lacked the stone that they needed. Because of this, the Mononarthans developed into adept miners, preferring to trade the raw ores to outsiders for tools to keep mining, food when times were tough, and precious jewelry for the few that wanted to show off their wealth and status. The Kurzi Mountains acted both as a shield and a barrier to the Mononarthans. Outside of a few permanent settlements to the east where trade occurred, outsiders rarely stepped into the mountains. These mountains were incredibly cold, especially during the winter, whereas much of Mashka had a more temperate weather. Steep slopes and inclines made it difficult for a people that were used to walking through fields. Stories of avalanches also made many Mashkans fearful of entering the Kurzi Mountains. Thus, the Mononarthans lived separate from the rest of Mashka. For the most part, outside of trade, the Mononarthans were isolated from the rest of the world. Compared to the various Mashkan kingdoms who were usually happy with shoving a blade into someone else for a few grains of rice, the Mononarthans were focused more on survival and spiritual wellness, which we'll cover in a bit. Mononarthan society was split into numerous tribes. These tribes would inhabit various areas of the Kurzi Mountains and agreed to herd their animals in their respective territories. The borders of these tribes were by no means sound, and border disputes could cause conflict. However, conflict between Mononarthan tribes was scarce, and it declined through the years. This was because of the increasing role of shamans. Shamans were the most well-respected people in society. Both men and women could be shamans. The Mononarthans believed that the gods condemned violence, and that living a life filled with peace was preferable to the gods. Because of this, shamans oftentimes acted as diplomats and peacekeepers between the tribes, preventing violence between them. To those that did commit violence, at best the gods would simply refuse their worship, which would leave these people completely isolated. At worst, the gods would spread disease to kill their livestock and shake the mountains with terrible earthquakes until the Mononarthan tribes responsible were swept into piles of snow. If none of that worked, they would bring infertility and make the descendants of those who committed violence mad. For thousands of years, the Mononarthans were content in this lifestyle. They had everything that they ever needed and wanted. However, things would take a turn around the year 2230 of the Third Era. To explain this part of the story, we need to turn north to the Eastern Desertlands. The Eastern Desertlands sit in between Mashka and what would later become known as Nartha. By 2230 of the Third Era, the Eastern Desertlands was dominated by the Algamorans, a culture belonging to the Kedivite race. Kedivites are a tall, dark-skinned race of humans well known for their prominence in magic. Their dark skin, which can range from a dark brown to a dark red, helps them adapt to the intense heat of the Desertlands. The Kedivites live a far longer lifespan than all of the Wolfa. While Wolfa can only live up to 60 years, Kedivites have their lives split into two parts. Many Kedivites will die in their 80s, but some can live all the way up to 200 years old. Their long lifespans means that Kedivites have plentiful amounts of time to venture into magic and alchemy, which many Algamorans did. They were certainly helped by the eastern desert's abundance of herbs, since this region of Ahri is the most abundant when it comes to herbs out of any continent. Some examples include the purple flower tennis that was used in various alchemical recipes to heal wounds or ease pregnancy for women. Or there was the infamous gok flower, a highly volatile and reactive flower that is frequently used in potions of war, healing, and even ancient biological weapons. But herbs alone cannot feed an entire civilization. For a powerful kingdom to last, it needs plentiful amounts of food and water. For a while, the Algamorans were able to sustain their population. By the year 2230 of the Third Era, Algamora had grown to be a substantial and powerful kingdom. The king of Algamora, Mevarez IV, had gathered for himself the most power that an Algamoran ever had. However, as the Algamoran population grew, problems started to arise. The farms of Algamora just could not keep up with the growth of many Algamoran cities. As the name suggests, the eastern Desertlands is, shockingly, a desert. Now, it has many a number of rivers and oases that help provide water, and since herbs can grow in the desert, Algamorans found ways to cultivate herbs and even grain. The process of farming in the Desertlands is very complicated, which I won't get into here. But even with their adaptability with farming, only so much land could be used. More and more, the Algamoran kingdom had to trade for its food. They also had many enemies surrounding them. Powerful Mashkan kingdoms could threaten them to the south. Pirates raided their eastern coastline, sometimes pillaging entire cities. And there were nomadic peoples emerging from other parts of the Desertlands to raid and conquer large swaths of Algamoran territory. To Mesopotamian IV and many Algamorans, it was becoming more and more clear that they needed to migrate in order to survive. It just so happened that a vulnerable land to the south was embroiled in many civil wars. Rich with land, resources, and everything else that the Algamorans could have wanted, Mashka seemed to be the perfect choice. And indeed it was, as Mashka was split into a number of kingdoms that feuded with each other more often than not. Many of the powerful kingdoms had experienced civil wars in the past as well. Mashka's wars certainly aided in Mesarev's upcoming invasion of Mashka, but his army had a key advantage. Because they had more battle mages than the Mashkan kingdoms, they could do things that other armies couldn't afford to. Magic was used to ease their logistics by supplying soldiers with food and water when needed, giving the Algamorans leeway to move more freely. Magic could also be used on the battlefield, either to scare away enemies with terrifying spells or to destroy them in a blaze with fire and other magic. The Mashkins had one significant advantage, though, and that was numbers. Mesarev fielded 30,000 soldiers in total, an impressive army in those times, but especially for Algamora. Very few kingdoms or empires from the deserts could raise such large numbers. However, Mashkin kingdoms could easily raise twice that number, and no matter how many battles the Algamorans won, once the Mashkin kingdoms agreed to stop fighting with each other, their numerical advantage only grew. Eventually, Mesarev IV would suffer a crushing blow in 2234, which reduced their hold on Mashka to territories in the north. However, the Mashkin kingdoms would soon start to squabble with each other once more, giving Mesarev IV time to plan his strategy. He ultimately decided that Algamora needed a strong fortified area in order to launch further attacks. If the Algamorans stayed in the fields of northern Mashka, they would have a disadvantage when defending against an enemy. Retreating home was not an option either. By 2235, the Algamorans had a population of around 560,000. A vast majority of these people, around 80%, had already burned their homes and traveled with the army into Mashka. To them, there was no turning back. The only part of northern Mashka that was guaranteed to give them a fortified spot were the Kurzy Mountains, and thus Mesarev marched to the Kurzy Mountains. When the Mononarthans heard of this approaching army, they sent a delegation of shamans in an attempt to negotiate. The Mononarthans offered many things: tribute, men for war, oars, really anything that they had. But the Algamorans refused. The Mononarthans were quickly subdued. Their society was not accustomed to dealing with foreign invaders, so when the Algamorans attacked, there was little resistance outside of the weather and a few skirmishes. Eventually, the Mononarthans fell under the guise of their Algamoran occupiers. It is believed that there were around 400,000 Mononarthans before the invasion. The Algamorans burned down Mononarthan huts, slaughtered their animals, and butchered over 120,000 Mononarthans. Those that survived the carnage were taken as slaves. These slaves were forced to mine stone and haul it for miles to their occupiers in brutal conditions in order to build a fort for the Algamorans. With very little food or water or clothing, winter and disease would kill another 150,000. By the time the fort was complete and winter had passed, the Algamorans had also suffered. Their provisions were running low, with the supply of food becoming scarce. Many Algamorans relied more and more on the remaining livestock that the Mononarthans had, and when that ran out, some soldiers went as far as to murder and consume Mononarthan slaves. Mesopotamian IV eventually decided to deport the Mononarthans northward in order to work on various plantations as slaves. They were going to harvest herbs to help brew more potions to help in the war effort. And so, once a further 12,000 Algamoran soldiers came to reinforce the Algamorans, the Mononarthans were sent off to their new homes. The Algamorans were brutal masters. Frequent beatings, the withholding of basic needs like food and water, and sometimes just blatant murder occurred during the Death March. Due to this, along with the brutal desert heat that the Mononarthans were not adjusted to, another 50,000 Mononarthans died. If you're counting, that is only 80,000 Mononarthans out of 400,000 just a few years earlier. Once the Death March was over, the Mononarthans were housed outside of the city of Southkis and sold to their new masters. The Mononarthans were scattered to various herbal plantations to prevent a large rebellion of Mononarthans from occurring. The Mononarthans were not the only slaves that the Algamorans held captive. Many other groups, including other Algamoran Kedavites, were enslaved. However, many texts depict the Mononarthans as having a especially brutal time in their captivity. It was during this brutal enslavement that a prophet would emerge. A former shaman who attempted to negotiate with the Algamorans, who turned a survivor of the initial Algamoran conquests, the Death March, and of the plantations. His name was Mosil. For a quick note, the story of Mosil is a debated one, with numerous sources contradicting one another. Different sects of Tevarism believe in different versions of Mosil, mostly so that Mosil aligns with their beliefs. For this story, we will follow the most popular version of the story, which is told by a sect of Tevarism known as Kurzi Tevarism. We will talk about Tevarism in a minute. To anyone at the time, Mosil would have seemed to be destined to suffer the same fate as all other slaves in Algamor. However, one night, Mosil managed to slip from his bonds. The Algamoran slavers retaliated by killing several Mononarthan slaves and lowering the rations for the rest of them. Mosil was able to escape, yes, but now he was stuck alone in the desert. He was dehydrated, starving and limping in deserts where any number of animals could have killed him. Snakes, scorpions, even birds were known to hunt and kill people. Other than herbs, many of which were inedible to even the Mononarthans, there was no food and no water. It seemed likely that he would just get dehydrated and die. Hopeless, Mosil laid down and accepted his fate. But when he gazed up at the moon, he saw a blue haze forming over him. That blue haze was Telvar, the god of wisdom. Mosil was well known by his compatriots as a kind, compassionate wolfer. He regularly chose to starve himself so that he could give food and charity to the suffering and unfortunate, and he was said to have been a great shaman, healing many people and performing miracles that even the Algamorans a magic race themselves thought to be impossible. For example, a story goes that he was able to resurrect over 500 animals from the dead when they drank from tampered water. He also prevented several conflicts between Mononarthan tribes, which saw some as Mosil saving people from a great natural disaster. Telvar told Mosil to return to his bondage, and in return Telvar would return 7 nights later to deliver a new message. Believing this to be the blessing of one of his gods, Mosil wandered back to the Algamorans and surrendered himself the next morning. They punished him ruthlessly, tearing his skin with their clubs and whips, chaining him to the walls for over 3 days in a row to boil in the sun, and forcing him to eat sand. They also scalped his fur using knives in their hands. Yet despite this torture, it is said that he smiled whenever the Algamorans appeared. When Mosil was getting ready to sleep on the 7th night, he found the blue mist forming over him once more. Telvar told Mosil that he was not one of the Mononarthan gods. Telvar was no mere deity, but he was specifically the Lord of Wisdom. He told Mosil that the Mononarthans would hopelessly die unless Mosil took the Telvarian principles and guided the Mononarthans to the land of Numaraka. When he left, a single stone tablet appeared on the ground. They contained hieroglyphs, which, when touched, shared Mosil the Telvarian principles. To greatly oversimplify, the Telvarian principles are a series of stone tablets known as the 14 tablets given to Mosil and his disciples. They outline both the religious laws of Telvarism and the steps to achieve nirvana. Nirvana, in the context of Telvarism, is a state of the soul in which you achieve total wisdom and harmony with yourself and the wider universe. Telvarism preaches about the need for humility, the capacity for knowledge, and the constant need to better one's self. Throughout the next year, Mosil secretly preached to the enslaved Mononarthans. Night and day he would preach, either to a few people privately, or sometimes even giving speeches to hundreds when their captors couldn't listen. Mosil told them to not ill think of their captors. Instead, he told them to hold onto hope, that one day the land of Numaraka would be revealed to the eyes of those that persevered through the worst of days. He told them about Telvar, the wise god. It would not be through the power of any gods that we escape the Algamorans. Rather, it would be the way that we view the world and how we react to it, Mosil told them. Before the Algamorans could catch on, Mosil decided that the only way out of bondage was a quick escape. Different sources tell different stories, with some sects of Telvarism believing that no violence occurred. Most said that some violence occurred, but it was limited, and some believe that the Mononarthans massacred the Algamorans. Whatever story is to be believed, the outcome was the same, with the Mononarthans escaping from their enslavers. As the word spread of Mosil's escape, many other Mononarthans rioted against their enslavers, leading to many Algamorans and Mononarthans being killed during the slave riots. When all of the Mononarthans had gathered north of Thatched, they numbered at an estimated 40,000. It is from there where the march to Numaraka would begin. Before the march to Numaraka, 14 men appeared to Mosil, 12 Wolfa, and 2 enslaved Algamorans. The men told Mosil that Telvar had gone to them as well, and Mosil told them in return to read him the Telvarian tablet. When the 14 men recited the tablet, Mosil made them his disciples. One of the disciples was an Algamoran named Marcenus, who would play a role in Numaraka, which will be the next video. Starvation and dehydration were widespread during the first few weeks, killing around 10,000 of them. Numerous times the Mononarthans were on the verge of riot and disbanding. Many thought the march of Numaraka was a hopeless endeavor, given to Mosil by some evil Shevku in order to deceive them. The term Shevku means an evil or malevolent force that belongs to a Shevku god. It can either refer to a malevolent god or an entity. Mosil starved alongside the Mononarthans. He regularly refused to eat while other Mononarthans were starving, though sometimes he would eat or drink whatever water or food he needed to survive. One popular story goes that when he saw a woman and her child on the verge of death, he offered them his arm. It is said that they survived to the march of Numaraka. Another story tells that when Mosil came across the Uneri River, he made sure that every man, woman, and child would be able to drink the water before he did. Only then did he drink the water. As the Algamorans were focused on conquering Mashka, most of the northern cities and towns had been abandoned. Their inhabitants, who were mostly non-Algamoran people, were more charitable. They gave the Mononarthans food, shelter, and gifts. Mosil was given a tennis necklace. Instead of keeping it for himself, he handed it off to Marcinus. The necklace, later known as the Mewa, would become a symbol for terrorism, and it would be worn by numerous disciples and even future prophets. Eventually, the Mononarthans decided to depart through the deserts rather than on the coast, as the coasts were rampant with cities and brigands that would have attacked and captured many of them on the way. It was through these deserts that the Mononarthans began to suffer once more from the rampant heat. And while the occasional oasis or village sending supplies their way could help alleviate that, it still wasn't enough. Thus, Mosil took the task upon himself to starve for his people. He refused to drink or eat anything until he could guarantee that the people were fed. And while the Mononarthans would eventually reach the land of Numaraka, Mosil was not one of them. On the way to Numaraka, he succumbed to dehydration. The 14 disciples would then lead the Mononarthans the rest of the way, all the way to the Niam River, from where they crossed it, officially entering Numaraka. Mosil would be venerated by many as the first and perhaps the greatest prophet. However, despite being venerated as the greatest Telvarian, most Telvarians believed that Mosil never achieved nirvana after his death. Whatever you may say about Mosil's religious impact, his impact on northern history is undeniable. While he is mostly a religious figure at the head of terrorism, he was also a leader who led a scattered peoples through one of the harshest terrains within Ahri, giving the Mononarthans just enough hope and determination to keep moving forward. And eventually, they arrived at their new home. Without him. Thank you for watching. The next video will cover the Narthans as they settle into their new territory and how they came to dominate such a land. Have a good day or night, and I'll see you all another time. Various kingdoms and empires would rise and fall through the millennia, with the earliest kingdoms taking shape. What? Telvar. Wait, no. What? No, that's way too early. What? No, that's the paragraph above. Telvar told Mosil to return to his bondage Bondage? Bondage! Eventually, the Mononarthans decided to depart away from the river and towards the desert, rather than